When I think back to when I was growing up, there was no such thing as a color TV, so whenever we watched television, it was always black and white. And I never saw color TV until I was in college. And going back to the 60s, when you watched something on TV, it was very grainy. It was not clear. But I can remember distinctly seeing things, and you can catch emotions, you can catch feelings from different people as they're on black and white.
Good evening. The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the two major candidates for the presidency.
Linkage institutions are powerful tools connecting everyday citizens to their government. On September 26, 1960, the media took its place in the Iron Triangle, becoming a tool that could determine who would win a presidential election. The year 1960 was when the first televised presidential debate took place between Mississippi Senator John F. Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon. Viewers turned on their black and white televisions, some for the very first time, to watch these two men convince America why they should hold the most important seat in the Oval Office.
I remember Senator Kennedy, and I can remember Vice President Nixon. There was a suaveness about President Kennedy. I mean, he was just so cool. He was calm. He was collected. He seemed to make love to the camera. You know, whenever they filmed him, he knew exactly how to look. He knew where to look. And Vice President Nixon, although I would dare say he was probably the better politician, Kennedy was a newbie. Kennedy had no experience, really, just as a couple of years as a senator.
The reason Franklin Roosevelt was a good neighbor in Latin America was because he was a good neighbor in the United States. Because they felt that the American society was moving again. I want us to recapture that image.
The way that Vice President Nixon presented himself, he seemed nervous, he seemed distracted, he was sweating. I remember him, he was stammering. And President Kennedy was, Senator Kennedy at the time, he was just smiling. As I said, it was almost like he could make love to that camera. And people who saw him for the first time literally went, wow. So there was we learned a lot from that debate. Nixon, I think, was in his prime when he went against Kennedy. He was just coming out of being vice president under Eisenhower. That was a very sedate, that was a very calm time, the 50s, and even just 1960 was the election. I think he was much better equipped than Senator Kennedy to be president at that time. But again, President Kennedy, I can remember, I loved Jack, and I can remember seeing his picture, and he had that big waft of brown hair. The women fell in love with him. You know, literally, he was like a rock star. He was the first idol to become president of the United States. President Nixon was not a good-looking man, and you could see it right away. It was obvious.
On our international position. There is no question but that this nation cannot stand still, because we are in a deadly competition. A competition not only with the men in the Kremlin, but the men in Peking. We're ahead in this competition, as Senator Kennedy, I think, has implied. But when you're in a race, the only way to stay ahead is to move ahead.
It is popular belief that John F. Kennedy won the debate and ultimately the presidency because of his charisma, character, demeanor, and the way he presented himself on television. He set the precedent that becoming the head of the executive branch involves becoming an expert in Hollywood. Many say Nixon won the votes of those not able to tune in to watch, but instead listen in on the radio. While it is true that Kennedy said many things that would have made him a strong president, Nixon managed to cover a lot of the concerns that America was having at the time. Nixon addressed Kennedy's false claims that the country isn't doing anything about the threat of communism spreading to Americas. Nixon argued, saying we have been doing plenty, and under his administration we'd be doing even more. Nixon addressed that Kennedy would be spending about $10 billion more every year just to do what the Republican Party would be able to buy, spending less.
All I can think of was when President Nixon was in the White House, he opened the doors to China. He was a good president. He did some stupid things like most presidents in this country do. But before President Nixon, he wasn't reported. They didn't say what went on in the White House during Roosevelt's time. They didn't say what was going on. They never showed him in a wheelchair. The country never knew he was a cripple. If they did, I bet you he would not have been elected. President Kennedy, I mean, he had to walk with a cane. He had to walk with a crutch. He had very severe disease. People didn't know that. If they did, I wonder. And quite frankly, too, a lot of people say his father Joe bought him the presidency. The one who was supposed to be the president was Jack Kennedy's older brother, Joe, but he was killed in the war in a plane. Plane crashed in London. So the press is going to make you or break you. You can be the darling or the villain.
Today, presidents and potential candidates spend more money on their campaigns and playing towards the crowd than time actually making policies and doing what is best for America. Most of this money is going towards advertisements on television, public relations assistants, and campaign managers, all to make their candidate look as good as possible. Many presidents that came before the invention of television would have never been elected by the American people. Our founding fathers, Abraham Lincoln, and even the disabled president Franklin Roosevelt would have been rejected by the people because they didn't look like someone the people wanted representing their country. The internet today is just as powerful as the television was in 1960. We are now able to watch, view, subscribe, and even leave comments on the personal lives of candidates. Kennedy knew that sounding the part of president simply wasn't enough to win an election once television broadcasting came into play, and people would see the man they wanted to vote for from the comfort of their home. Now it's all about looking like a person that the people can trust and looking like a person who will represent our nation the best.